Yeah, my name's Carl. I am co-founder of Flagsmith. Flagsmith is an open source feature flag management platform, and I'm going to be talking about feature flags today, unsurprisingly. I'm quite new to speaking, so sorry if I'm nervous and looking up at the screen. This is my third talk. Hopefully I do a good job and you come away with a lot of knowledge, because I've got a lot to talk about when it comes to feature flags. Just out of interest, how many of you have used feature flags before? Right. Okay, so yeah, around 20%. Yeah. I started around 6 years ago, and the sort of scene was a lot more new. I only got an inkling that I wanted to start this through working on quite a large medical project, and the releases were every 6 months. Very scary releases, and if things went wrong, rolling back would be sort of really tough, and there was a lot of code, a lot of merge conflicts, so that was why I started Flagsmith as a bit of history. If we can... Oh, is the mouse here? Oh, okay. Brilliant. Okay. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about today? So I'm going to be talking about feature flags, but prior to that, I'm going to be talking about the importance of open source. Flagsmith is an open source company. We created it open source from the ground up. So I guess I've got a lot of insights, and I'd really encourage anyone who's creating their own projects to consider making them open source, because I believe it will make them better. Then we're going to be talking about the bottlenecks that we face in order to release code. A lot of things need to happen to release code, especially on a big system where the sort of importance of getting things right is mission critical and things can go really wrong. So I'm going to be talking about the bottlenecks there and how feature flags can help solve these bottlenecks. Then I'm going to be taking a practical example of how we helped a Swiss bank go from a very legacy sort of build architecture to using feature flags and a lot of modern development practices. And I'm going to tie up with how we can monitor feature flags in production. There we go. So yeah, I wanted to put this slide in here, like starting an open source company, because it means a lot to me, the open source sort of movement, and seeing a lot of good quality projects come out of that. So I started back in 2016, and really feature flags were quite new at the time, and there wasn't anything open source. And I was using a few open source tools, so it felt a bit unfair that no one had access to feature flags at the time. I knew I wanted it. There was no open source provider out there. It was all met by sort of contact sales, and I just didn't believe in that. I'd used a lot of great tools that I couldn't live without before, so I wanted to start that. And I started that by setting up the following goals. I believe that anyone should have access to tooling that promotes best practice, like feature flags. Whether you're a solo developer all the way up to a Goliath company, I believe that you should have access to the right tool to essentially do your job well. And you shouldn't really have to be met with sort of like marketing people and sales people in order to try out a tool to essentially do your job better. So that was one of my core goals. And I believe that open source shouldn't be synonymous with sort of low quality tooling as well. I think over the years since 2016, open source has come a long way in providing with some of the best tooling in the world. And I wanted open source to be connected with pushing the boundaries of tooling rather than being sort of low quality, non-production ready tooling. So that's essentially what I did, and today you can download Flagsmith off of GitHub, and it's the exact same code base that serves billions of requests per month for some of the biggest companies in the world. So anyone without talking to sales, you can download completely for free and use feature flags and Flagsmith and that sort of thing. And you might wonder why and how can you do that? If you're creating a product, the idea is to sell it and make a bunch of money, right? Like, how can you open source absolutely everything in your code base? And I'd really like to challenge that without open source, Flagsmith wouldn't be as high quality as it is today. And there's a really good reason for that. The second you put your code and make it open source, you're shining a spotlight on it. I don't know how many sort of projects internally you guys have worked on and seen all of the skeletons sort of there. Maybe you've got public, private keys sort of in the code base, and you think, how much work would it take to make it open source? And it tends to be a lot, right? So in things being open source, you're shining a spotlight on the code quality, and essentially security vulnerabilities as well. You can't really have massive security vulnerabilities if your code is fully out in the open. And I think as well, it's just a win-win for everyone. You get so much insights from an open source community, challenging your product, maybe having their own ideas, committing their own ideas to your product that you wouldn't have thought of without it being open source. And of course, there's social impacts like having a tool that can be used for free in educational institutions and charities without having to sort of pay if they don't have the funding. So yeah, I think if you're looking to start a project, consider making it open source, or at least a large part of it. Of course, you can hide away proprietary stuff if you're worried about sort of being able to sell your project, but more often than not, you can give value to a community and get a lot back as a result of that. So yeah, just a shout out to open source and how important I believe it is to this entire industry. There we go. And that leads on to open feature. So I don't know if any of you have used OpenTelemetry before. Show of hands, yeah. So we partnered with the founders of OpenTelemetry to create open feature. So open feature, essentially, you want to use feature flags, you've got to choose a vendor. Vendors will have code like flagsmith.init. Instead of doing that, you go to open feature and you use their SDK. And the point in that is, no matter which provider you end up choosing, you can switch providers without changing any code. And the idea of that is you don't get locked into a particular provider. You're free to use whatever provider you want, and it's down to what suits your needs best. So if you haven't used feature flags before and you want to get started, going to open feature, you're not tied to a single provider. It's all open source. We're on the governance board for that and are helping pushing that for teams to start using. So yeah, definitely recommend that if you want to look at feature flags. But getting on to feature flags, what are the bottlenecks we have in terms of releasing code? I've categorized this into three main areas. Firstly, the most obvious, bottlenecks within development. So this could be back-end developers not being ready, so the front-end developers' work is waiting. It could be vice versa, maybe API is finished, but front-end development is not complete. Or it could be within their own teams where you have merge conflicts and pull requests in review, sort of stacking up, gaining merge conflicts over time. That's a massive bottleneck because often resolving those merge conflicts is quite difficult and erroneous as well. I'd say sort of merge conflicts are one of the leading causes from the front-end aspect. That's my sort of background to bugs that I see within production applications. But it's not just developers that are to do with the bottleneck, it's the wider team as well. So let's say your code's all ready, but you're waiting on QA. Or let's say your code's all ready and all completely tested, and you're waiting on a product owner to sign it off. It's not just the developers, the bottleneck, but it's this whole orchestration of things that need to happen for features to get out to production. And to summarize this problem, the deployment of code is coupled to the deployment of the feature. And that's the main problem that we're trying to solve. And then on to the deployment aspects. So this definitely applies to people who are not doing sort of trunk-based development. Maybe you have sort of development environments, staging environments. And even if you're using trunk-based development, you've probably got like a release candidate and you sort of package things up into sort of like a tagged release. Guaranteeing the readiness of that release is quite difficult because you've got a bunch of people pushing code out, their new features out towards a release, and guaranteeing the readiness of that release is quite difficult, right? Because the goalposts are always moving. Let's say a new feature goes into a release candidate, you've got to do all of these previous things I've talked about before everyone else's code can get out to production. Let me see, sorry. And this is even worse if you've got multiple development environments and you're not going straight to production, you're pushing through to sort of staging, test, pre-production. A lot of time and effort is spent sort of doing that. And to counteract that, some companies even employ code freezes. And the idea of a code freeze is to have a period of calm so that you can get all of this stuff done. But this is a literal bottleneck on development. You're literally freezing, sort of pushing features to production. And rolling back is extremely difficult as well. If you've got a big release and a lot of things are going on in that release, rolling back an individual feature is really quite difficult. You'd have to do cherry picking, a load of erroneous sort of tasks in order to roll back from a disaster. And to summarize this, big releases are scary. Sorry, could you push this slide? It's not, oh, there we go. So how do we solve these problems? I'm going to tackle the development sides of things first because I believe that's quite simple to solve. With front-end and back-end developers, I found that employing a data design up front tends to help out things quite a bit. And the idea of this is you agree on your API structures up front before a front-end and developer starts their work. And this might seem simple, but if you're singing from the same hymn sheet, a front-end developer does not have to wait for the back-end developer to deploy their code in order to get the job done. And the back-end developer doesn't have to rewrite a load of code when they realize that the front-end can't work with the APIs that have been sort of produced. So creating a data structure up front and employing some sort of like contract testing can really help out with those bottlenecks. But that doesn't solve merge conflicts and pull requests building up over time, because that's within like a single sort of discipline. So how do we solve that? Well, feature flags help solve that in that they let you deploy to production a lot quicker. The idea is you wrap your code up in the safety net of a feature flag. And as long as you've done that, it doesn't matter if the feature is completely ready. It doesn't matter if the QA has been done. It doesn't matter if the product owner has signed it off. Because what we're doing is we're decoupling the code from the actual feature. Essentially, you wrap your feature in a feature flag, it reaches production, but the users don't see that feature because the feature flag is turned off. And this avoids merge conflicts because you get your pull requests through more quickly. But on the team side of things, that unlocks a hell of a lot of bottleneck. Engineers don't have to wait for QA. You don't have to have this massive orchestration of planning a release. Product owners are then empowered to choose when a feature gets delivered, regardless of what release it's part of. If you're releasing a load of features underneath one sort of like push to production, you can turn one or two of those on whenever you want without affecting the rest of the code that's gone out to production. So what for DevOps, what for sort of all of the environments and the sort of way we're doing sort of either trunk-based development or sort of development environments? Well, this has been quite interesting and something I didn't expect when creating Flagsmith. The reliance on pre-production environments, if you're using feature flags, becomes way less, because if you're deploying the code behind a safety net of a feature flag, you kind of get to choose what environment you turn that feature on. So if you've got that choice, why not turn it on in production or as near to production as possible as part of your testing? If you can test in production, I really recommend that you do. With feature flags, you can essentially turn on a feature for a subset of people. So the idea is you can have a group of people that's your internal users, and you can roll out a feature to production under the safety net of a feature flag and turn it on just for you guys. And what that means is you're testing as close to what the customer is seeing as possible. Whereas before, if you have like a massive release and your development environment is so far behind your production environment, essentially, what are you really testing? You're not testing something that's reflecting production at all. You've got a load of code that's untested that you're sort of testing there. And you do this big release to production and you find out that something goes wrong. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how feature flags has affected DevOps. But let's take a practical example. So a couple of years ago, we helped a Swiss bank go from doing 3 deployments per year, massive sort of distributed architecture. They really wanted to modernize due to a lot of the things I've talked about on the previous slide. It was an absolute nightmare getting to the point where they're doing one of their 3 yearly release cycles. They have a ton of code to go out to production. The ramifications are extremely high. They're a bank. So things going wrong, it's extremely stressful, and there's a lot going on there. And to the previous talk, complexity is one of the biggest issues, right? If you can simplify that process and roll out small iterative changes, you're more likely to make fewer mistakes, fewer big mistakes, because the release isn't big and scary, as I've sort of said before. So how did they do that? So they started off by redesigning their environments. So they went from tons of development environments down to just testing and staging. And you might not think that's very impressive, and before I was suggesting test in production, but this is a bank. They've got a lot of sort of regulatory requirements. They're legally not allowed to just push to production. They have to test in a non-production environment. So how did they compensate for that? They still needed a pre-production environment. How did they compensate for that? Well, they compensated from that by pushing to production as quickly as possible, minimizing the difference between the pre-production environment and the production environment. So when they're testing in the non-production environment, they can be way more confident that they're actually testing something that reflects production. So that's like a mile away from doing 3 releases a year. The difference in production compared to development is maybe 1 or 2 commits. So once they did that, they sort of empowered non-technical product owners to sort of test in production. Before that, what they essentially had to do was round everyone up, and you could imagine in a big bank organization, the red tape and the sort of all of the meetings that would have to happen for a feature to get out to production. It was costing a hell of a lot of money. So this empowers non-technical stakeholders to be in charge of releases. So I've kind of explained at a high level sort of how that worked, but let me break it down to a lower level so I can say exactly how you develop with feature flags, and how this team develops with feature flags, and how we at Flagsmith do as well. First of all, before writing any code, create a feature flag. And this is really important because the point of a feature flag is to roll out safely to production with the safety net of a feature flag. If you create the feature flag last, then you're likely to miss areas of the code that you've built with a feature flag, and then you're pushing out code to production that's not protected by a feature flag. So create the feature flag first, then write the code. That's really important. And even before you write business logic, write a skeleton wrapper for where your code's going to live, so you always know the feature flag is there, and the code that you're writing is wrapped within that feature flag. Then what we do is we push the code when the code's ready, not when the feature's ready necessarily. You can actually push out work in progress features, and quite often it's better to do that than let a feature sort of stay for too long, gaining merge conflicts, getting stale and not into production. So they push the feature when the feature's ready. And they might not even turn on that feature for months. So the point of this all is to get the code out to production so you don't have this big mammoth task and this big scary task of pushing a load of code at one period of time. Instead, they could leave it 3 months before they turn on that feature in production. But it's there, and you're empowering the non-technical stakeholders to choose when that exactly happens. We cut out bottleneck. So once the feature is in production and the feature flag is turned on, I've said that the feature flags are a safety net, but sooner or later you got to turn on the feature, right? So what happens then? They use APM monitoring, in particular Dynatrace. I don't know whether anyone here uses Dynatrace. Essentially an APM monitoring tool that allows you to treat feature flags like deployment events, and essentially couple up turning on a feature flag to an increased sort of like error rate. And yeah, if you haven't heard of Dynatrace, essentially it's like Datadog, and there's many tools like this, like New Relic and that sort of thing. But the idea is to treat turning on a feature flag like an APM deployment event. So once they've done that and features are deemed as stable in production, it's important to delete feature flags because feature flags actually are tech debt, because you don't want in a few years' time all of your code wrapped in many sort of if statements, essentially. That's what feature flags kind of are without sort of the more advanced capabilities of feature flags. So essentially you have to identify the stale flags, then remove them from the code base, and then eventually from the feature flag system itself. And that kind of completes the feature flag lifecycle. And then keep rinse and repeat doing that for every single feature they create. So they're well away from sort of 3 deployments a year, and essentially as soon as the code's ready, it's in production. So how do we monitor feature flags in production? So I'm sure a lot of you use monitoring tools, and there's a lot of importance on once feature flags or features are out in production, that they're monitored for stability to make sure that the website or app or whatever it is not breaking. So how do you do that? The first is testing in or near production. So you've got your feature underneath the safety net of a feature flag. Essentially what you do is you create a segment of users that represents your internal team. So someone logging in with an email address belonging to your domain, they get put into a group and you can turn on the features just for those people. So you're testing in production, and that's the sort of first step to guaranteeing the stability in production. But then what you can do is sort of slowly sort of surface it to your customers, either by rolling out that feature flag to like 10, 20% of the users, or having a controlled group of people that who have opted into sort of like a beta program or that sort of idea. So the first 2 steps are essentially controlling the rollout and not simply exposing the feature to everyone. And before feature flags, this kind of wasn't possible, right? You kind of had to take this massive leap of faith to pushing out a load of code to production. And imagine if you were doing that 3 times a year and you were pushing out thousands and thousands of lines of code. That's like quite a leap, essentially. And then sort of once it's reached your user base, there's 2 rules of thumb that I've sort of come up with, and they relate to sort of APM monitoring. First of all, you treat turning on a feature flag just like you would normally treat deploying code to production. So turn on a feature flag, create a deployment event in your favorite sort of APM tool, then you can sort of couple up increased error rates with turning on a feature flag. But feature flags don't have to be on for everyone. So let's say you're rolling out to 20% of users and they're seeing an increased error rates. So that leads into my second sort of rule of thumb. Treat a user who's seeing a particular feature as an APM session user property. And I guess what I mean by that is if you're seeing a load of sessions and they have a certain feature flag on, treat that as a trait so that you can couple people who have got a certain feature flag on with increased error rates. And here's a few screenshots of popular tooling doing exactly that with feature flags in production. So yeah, that covers pretty much everything I'd like to talk about. Yeah, if you've got any questions, please let me know.